Does The Shining really even need an introduction at this point? It's one of the most highly coveted horror films of all time. 41 years later, and we are still referencing this film as one of the best in the genre. I feel like what's contributed most to The Shining's longevity is the fact that it is so ambiguous. It gives you so much to dissect and leaves it all up to interpretation. Maybe it's a film about America's history of violence and genocide. Maybe it's a metaphor for domestic violence. Maybe the bear blowjob scene is meant to represent this man's resentment of himself for his homosexuality in the same vein as Jack Torrance's resentment of himself for his patriarchal role. Or maybe I'm just a film school professor or one of those lunatics from the documentary Room 237, ascribing meaning to a movie where there actually isn't any meaning at all. Maybe it's all of the above. F it, who knows? What you get out of the movie is basically entirely up to you, which is exactly why Stephen King hates this movie so much. Stephen King calls Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining a big, beautiful Cadillac with no engine inside it. Now, I haven't read Stephen King's original novel, but from what I can tell and from what I've been told, the film version of The Shining seems to strip the narrative of a lot of its emotional core. The characters, especially, are given much flatter character arcs, and the ending of the novel is entirely different from that of the film. It's interesting to me that Stanley Kubrick would be chosen to adapt a Stephen King story at all, given the massive differences in their artistic approach. Stephen King's stories have dark elements, but the focus is almost always on hope, redemption, and humanity, while Stanley Kubrick favors stories that are, how do I put it? Not quite so optimistic. Now, which of these approaches works best for The Shining? Well, like everything, that's entirely subjective. Personally, I love both King and Kubrick's stylistic choices, albeit for completely different reasons, and that is exactly why I consider Dr. Sleep to be the perfect sequel to The Shining. Dr. Sleep's approach is one that is incredibly risky. It's not interested in attempting to replicate Kubrick's film. It is only interested in continuing its story, and it does this by attempting to marry Kubrick and King's visions for The Shining into one film, serving as both an adaptation of King's novel of the same name, his sequel to his version of The Shining, but using Kubrick's Shining as a groundwork and progressing its story and its world. The reason that this is a huge risk is because this approach up front alienates the audience. As I said in the intro, Kubrick's Shining thrives in ambiguity. The first time you watch it, you'll be left with tons of questions, like what exactly is The Shining? Who is Tony? Were the ghosts of the Overlook actually real? Did the Overlook make Jack Torrance crazy? Or was he always crazy? Why was there a scene of a dude getting a blowjob from a guy in a bear costume? Dr. Sleep answers all of these questions and more, except for the one about the bear costume, the only one that anybody actually wanted an answer to. Not only that, but through its answers, it attempts to retrospectively help us emotionally resonate more with Stanley Kubrick's film. Now, if you're somebody who is a die-hard fan of Kubrick's vision for The Shining and you have really enjoyed scrubbing over every detail of the Overlook and uncovering its hidden meanings, this is probably going to feel like a slap in the face, but to me, even as a massive fan of Kubrick's film, I think it is a completely necessary slap in the face. The best analogy I can come up with to explain how I rationalize this is that Kubrick's The Shining is trauma, and Dr. Sleep is therapy. Trying to recollect traumatic experiences is extremely visceral and fragmented, and without guidance, it's extremely difficult or sometimes impossible to make sense of any of it. And that's the same experience you get from watching Kubrick's version of The Shining. In a therapeutic setting, you are challenged to compartmentalize and make peace with your pain, to recontextualize those traumatic experiences in a way that makes them easier to understand and emotionally process. And this is the same challenge that Dr. Sleep presents you with. This analogy also applies because it is directly tied to Dr. Sleep's narrative, and this is the point where I have to issue a slight spoiler warning. I'm going to try and keep it as light on spoilers as possible because I want more people to see this film and experience it, but to talk about the film at all, I do have to spoil a little bit. So if you haven't seen it and you want to go in with a completely fresh perspective, click off the video now, but if you want to hear my thoughts about it, continue watching. So our focus in Dr. Sleep is on Danny Torrance, now much older, and how he is struggling to cope with his traumatic past. He's succumbing to alcoholism and other forms of substance abuse to attempt to suppress his demons, which only leads him into self-destruction. Through the mentorship of the spirit of Dick Halloran, he is given answers to his lingering questions and put on a path toward recovery. Just as he begins to reach a place of stability, he develops a psychic connection with a young girl named Abra Stone. She, a lot like Danny, has supernatural abilities and is being hunted by evil forces wishing to feed on her. Now Danny must step into the role of the protector and mentor to this girl, and by the end of their journey, he must also return to the Overlook Hotel, the very source of his trauma. So the entire emotional crux of this narrative is about facing your trauma, making sense of it, and making peace with it, reaching a point of closure. The brilliance of this is that this narrative emotionally recontextualizes Kubrick's The Shining without taking anything away from it. This also allows the film to revisit the Overlook in a way that doesn't feel like unnecessary and hollow fan service, since it actually serves a purpose in the story. By seeing this world through Danny's lens, we are better able to understand The Shining in the same way that he is. We finally know what the ghosts of the Overlook really were, why they attacked the Torrance family, what having the ability to shine really means. And we also know what all of these things imply about the story world at large. The characters of Kubrick's Shining can at times feel one note or flat, but Dr. Sleep gives us a more rounded understanding of who they really were as people. We get to see more of Wendy Torrance and how what happened at the Overlook changed her as a human being and as a mother. And Danny's journey serves a dual purpose, both showing us what the events of the Overlook did to him, but also helping us better understand his father, Jack Torrance. One of King's biggest complaints about the film adaptation of The Shining was the casting of Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, a brilliant performance. But at no point do you really question whether or not this man is going to go crazy. He already looks like an insane person. Instead, the question becomes, when is this man finally going to snap? Danny's story in Dr. Sleep mirrors Jack's story in a lot of ways. A man consumed by alcoholism, making selfish and violent decisions and damaging other people as a result, and he decides to try to sober up, get a new job, and try to stay on a good path. By seeing Danny's struggles, we also begin to understand his father, and this turns Jack Torrance from an irredeemable monster into a fallible human being, and retrospectively reinforces The Shining as the tragedy that it always was. The key difference, though, being that Jack gave into his madness and allowed his demons to overtake him, while Danny fights them all the way until the end. He cares for Abra Stone enough to keep fighting, to endure the suffering so that it never consumes her the way that it did to him, to guide her the way that Dick Halloran did for him so that she can allow her light to shine into the world. And all of this culminates to resolve the lingering horrors of The Shining in a way that feels earned and intimate. No pun intended, but this is, to me, the shining example of a sequel executed perfectly. It shows reverence for both the source materials of Stanley Kubrick and Stephen King, while also standing as a work of its own. It doesn't attempt to remake The Shining, it just continues the story. It has haunting imagery, its narrative is consistently satisfying and emotionally engaging, and overall, it just enhances everything that was already great about The Shining. At the very least, even if you dislike the direction that Dr. Sleep takes, or if you find some of its elements comical, it's really hard to say that this film is at all disrespectful or detracts from Kubrick's film in any way. I think that it is fantastic, and if you have not seen it, I would highly recommend that you watch it right now. Apparently not many people did, and I think that's a travesty. I just wanted to talk up this film a little bit because I really do enjoy it. I rewatched it recently, and I still think that it is wonderful. That's going to be it for me for this one. I'll see you guys next time. Meeptop out.